Imagine losing your mother to cancer, only for your father to serve you legal papers at the funeral claiming you're a total fraud. He wanted the house, the money, and my reputation. But by the time I was done with him, he didn't just lose the case. He lost his freedom, his son, and the respect of every single person in our town. You're watching Real Reddit Revenge, and today we're diving into a massive case of family betrayal, where a daughter uses her classified military background to deliver the ultimate legal smackdown to her entitled father. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 28 years old. The first time my old man called me a total fraud, he wasn't just venting at the dinner table. He was screaming it in a packed Virginia courtroom while strangers whispered in the gallery. His voice cracked through the silence like a gunshot, and it was so loud even the court reporter froze mid-sentence. "That woman right there, she's not my daughter," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's a liar, a common thief, and a straight-up imposter wearing a uniform she never earned." I can still taste the air in that room. It smelled like stale floor wax and that burnt, bottom-of-the-pot courthouse coffee. I felt the bite of the winter wind still clinging to my blazer and the literal weight of 100 eyes judging me all at once. But then, my lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Evelyn, coolly slid a sealed envelope across the mahogany table. It had a dark blue Department of Defense seal and a Pentagon insignia. The judge opened it with the kind of slow, agonizing precision you see in movies. He read one line, then another. The energy in the room did a complete 180. He took off his glasses, leaned forward, and spoke in a voice so quiet it was actually terrifying. "Everyone in this courtroom will stand up, right now." I watched the color drain from my father's face. For the first time in 28 years, I saw him go from a local legend to a man who was absolutely terrified of his own kid. See, I was born in a town where guys like my dad, Thomas Bennett, were basically treated like monuments. Cedar Hollow, Virginia, isn't big enough for secrets to stay buried, but it's just small enough for good ol' boy pride to live forever. My dad had spent 23 years as a military police officer before retiring with a busted knee and a personality sharp enough to shave with. People in town worshipped him because he spoke like a man who'd survived the unthinkable. Maybe he had, but by the time I showed up, any softer side he had was long gone, especially when it came to his daughter. "Girls need a stable home and a husband," he'd grumble while watching my older brother, Jake, toss a football in the backyard. Men need a purpose." I was 8 years old when I realized I was never going to be enough. When Jake was 16, he totally trashed Dad's truck into a neighbor's brick mailbox. Dad laughed about it for a decade, calling it boys being boys. Meanwhile, I got a single B+ in chemistry junior year, and Dad didn't speak to me for 3 days straight. My mother, Alina, tried her best to keep the peace. She held our house together like someone trying to repair shattered glass with trembling fingers. She was the warmth to his frost. She'd sneak into my room at 2:00 a.m. just to tuck me in and whisper, "You don't have to become hard just to survive him, Claire." I didn't get it then. I definitely get it now. By 17, I wasn't just ready to leave Cedar Hollow, I was ready to vanish. I didn't want a stable life or a local husband. I wanted out. When the thick envelope from West Point arrived, my hands were shaking so hard I nearly ripped the letter. My mom started sobbing before I even finished the first paragraph. "Oh my God, Claire," she whispered, her hand over her heart. My dad didn't even look up from his medium-rare steak. "You'll wash out in 6 months," he said flatly. The room went dead silent. My mom stared at him. "Tom, please." "No," he interrupted, dead-eyed. "She's stubborn, but she's not strong. There's a big difference." I sat there in that dated dining room with the peeling yellow wallpaper, trying to keep my face a mask so he wouldn't see the tears. Outside, a summer rain was tapping against the glass. My brother, Jake, just smirked into his mashed potatoes like the smug jerk he was. That smirk hurt worse than the words. At West Point, I learned real fast that pain is just high-octane fuel if you know how to burn it. I learned to run until my lungs felt like they were filled with acid. I learned to pull a double shift on 2 hours of sleep and keep moving while guys twice my size were praying for me to fail. Some of them wanted me gone before I even opened my mouth. But here's the thing. When you spend your whole life being underestimated, you lose the ability to feel fear. During mountain training, I'd watch tough guys collapse from exhaustion while I just kept climbing. Not because I was a physical freak, but because I'd spent my entire childhood surviving my father's emotional deep freeze. Physical pain was easy. It was clean. When I graduated and got my commission, my mom drove 9 hours alone just to see me pin those bars on. My father, he had stuff to do. I found out later he spent that weekend throwing back beers at a fishing cabin with his buddies. I served in Germany, then Kuwait, and then moved into gray space assignments I wasn't legally allowed to tell my family about. I missed the holidays, the birthdays, the funerals, and the relationships that might have turned into marriages. Meanwhile, Jake was a walking disaster. Failed businesses, a DUI that nearly cost someone their life, and a mountain of gambling debt. And every single time Jake hit a wall, Dad was there to catch him. "That's my son," he'd say, like those 3 words excused every screw-up. The older I got, the more Dad seemed to resent my success. He hated it when neighbors asked about my promotions to major. He hated when people thanked me for my service at the grocery store. One Christmas, a family friend congratulated me on my new rank. My dad just snorted into his bourbon. "Military's soft now," he muttered. "It's all politics and quotas." The table went silent. My mom looked like she was about to break. That was the night I realized she'd spent 30 years apologizing for a man who didn't have a single ounce of sorry in his soul. Then the cancer hit. Pancreatic. It's a monster, fast and merciless. It steals people in chunks while you're forced to pretend everything's fine. I took emergency leave and spent 6 weeks living out of a hospital chair. At night, the machines would hum while the Virginia snow piled up outside. Sometimes Mom would hold my hand. Sometimes she'd just sleep. My father, he'd show up for 20 minutes, look bored, and leave. One night, while she was dozing off, he stood in the doorway and looked at me with pure venom. "You always were an attention seeker, weren't you?" I looked at him, stunned. "She's dying, Dad, and somehow you're making this about you." That was the closest I ever came to decking him. My mother opened her eyes before I could move, and she looked terrified, not of the cancer, but of what was happening between us. She died 48 hours later with her hand in mine. At the wake, people told me how proud she was of me, how she kept a photo of me in my dress blues right on her nightstand. My father didn't look at me once. After the burial, as the casserole brigade of relatives headed to the church basement, he cornered me by the cemetery gates. The wind was whipping through the dead grass. "You stopped being my daughter the second you put that uniform on over this family," he said. His voice was cold, final. I stared at him, convinced I'd misheard him, but he just turned and walked away, just like that. 3 weeks later, I was back in my kitchen in Arlington when I got served. Rain was hammering the windows while my coffee went cold. I read the summons once, twice, 5 times. My brain literally couldn't process the words on the page. Thomas Bennett was suing me for my mother's house, her life insurance, and every cent she'd left in her personal savings. But it was the last line that felt like a knife in the ribs. Claim filed under disputed paternity. According to my own father, I wasn't his kid at all. He wasn't just trying to rob me, he was trying to delete me from existence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, watching the rain streaks on the window like silver scars. Around 3:00 a.m., I did something stupid. I called Jake. I guess some part of me still thought brother meant something. "What?" he snapped, sounding annoyed. I woke him up. "You knew about the lawsuit." Silence, then a long, heavy sigh. "Dad's doing what he has to do, Claire." "He's claiming Mom was unfaithful, Jake. He's trashing her memory for a house." "So?" That one word hit me harder than a punch. "So, Claire, come on. Everyone knows you were her favorite. Dad's sick of it. He deserves that house." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "The house Mom paid for with her own inheritance, the one you were never around for." "You don't know what it was like here after you ditched us for the army," he yelled. "You think you're better than us because of that uniform." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I think Mom deserved better than both of you." He hung up. I stood there listening to the dial tone while thunder rolled over the Potomac. For the first time in a decade, I cried for my mother, Not because she was gone, but because she had loved these monsters. The lawsuit spread through Cedar Hollow like a brush fire. By the end of the week, the church crowd had picked sides. Some people called to offer sympathy, which was really just them digging for gossip. Others flat out ghosted me. Then the local paper ran a headline, "Decorated Officer Accused of Family Fraud." I sat in the Pentagon cafeteria, staring at that headline, unable to even take a bite of my salad. People were whispering. Conversations would die the second I walked into an elevator. My phone was blowing up with messages from old classmates and random cousins. One message read, "Is it true your real dad was some random soldier mom met?" I deleted it, but the humiliation was physical. It changes how you carry yourself. It makes you feel like you're wearing a target. And because my actual job was classified, I couldn't even defend myself. My father knew that. He was weaponizing the quiet professional code against me. 3 days later, I drove back to Cedar Hollow to meet a lawyer recommended by an old colonel friend. Her office was tucked above a hardware store on Main Street. The sign read, "Evelyn Brooks, Attorney at Law." The place smelled like old paper and peppermint. Evelyn was in her late 60s, with silver hair pinned back tight and eyes that could see through a brick wall. She didn't offer me tea or a tissue. "That man is dangerous," she said, tossing the lawsuit onto her desk. "He's my father," I whispered. "No," she corrected, her voice like steel. "He is your opposing counsel's client. Learn the difference or you're going to lose everything." For 2 hours, we went through every scrap of paper I had. She'd pause, underline something, and make a note in the margin. Finally, she leaned back. "Your father's story has holes, Claire. Big ones." "Like what?" "The kind that make judges very, very cranky." She slid a photocopy of my birth certificate toward me. "He's challenging the authenticity of this. But check this out. County records show that someone tried to access and alter the original digital files 6 months ago." I stared at her. "Alter them? You mean he tried to hack my birth certificate?" "Your father isn't just grieving, honey," Evelyn said with a cold smile. "He's been planning this hit for a long, long time." A cold, leaden heaviness settled into the pit of my stomach. Evelyn, my attorney, took off her glasses with a slow, deliberate motion that made my skin crawl. "Claire, talk to me about your military record. I need the truth, and I need all of it." "There's not much I'm legally allowed to discuss, Evelyn," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I get it. NDA culture, classified briefings, I've seen it before." Her voice softened just a fraction. "But if this circus reaches federal territory, a single surprise from the prosecution will destroy our case. They'll paint you as a shadow ops fraud who's hiding behind a top-secret sticker." I hesitated. For over a decade, secrecy hadn't just been part of the job, it was an instinct. It was muscle memory. Even now, there were massive blocks of my service record that lived behind digital firewalls and steel vaults that ordinary civilians would never even know existed. "I served overseas," I said, choosing my words like I was walking through a minefield. "Multiple tour, high-threat environments." "That much is in your public jacket," Evelyn countered. "What about the gaps? The 18-month stretch in the Middle East where you effectively vanished from the payroll?" "There were operations," I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "Attached to diplomatic security and sensitive recovery. The kind of stuff nobody acknowledges publicly, ever." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Outside her office window, the lonesome wail of a train horn echoed through the Virginia hills. Evelyn folded her hands together on her desk. "Claire, look at me. Is there anything protected under a federal seal that could verify your identity or prove your service history beyond a shadow of a doubt?" Immediately, a memory hit me like a physical blow. A windowless, locked briefing room in a basement at Fort Meade. A colonel with salt and pepper hair sliding a heavy black mat document case across a metal table. "Major," he had told me, "if your record is ever challenged in a civilian court, if some local DA or a vengeful ex tries to pull your file, you do not talk. You hand this to the judge. This goes through legal counsel only." At the time, I'd almost laughed. Who would be crazy enough to challenge a major's record? Now, looking at the lawsuit on Evelyn's desk, I realized my own father was exactly that kind of crazy. I might have something, I said quietly. Evelyn's eyes narrowed until they were sharp as needles. Might. I was instructed to never, ever open it unless it was a matter of national security or absolute personal necessity. Would you call your father calling you a bastard fraud? In the local news, an absolute necessity. I thought about him standing in that courtroom. I thought about my mom's final days, her hand shaking while he accused me of being a gold digger over her hospital bed. I thought about the headlines, the whispers at the grocery store, and the way my own brother had sold me out for a piece of property. Yeah, I said, my jaw tightening. It's necessary. That evening, I drove to a high-security storage facility outside Alexandria. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the weight of an incoming nor'easter. The traffic lights reflected off the wet asphalt like neon blood. The storage unit itself was a sterile, metal box lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly. It was cold enough to see my breath. Way in the back, tucked under a tarp, sat my old military footlocker. It was battered, covered in scratches from being tossed onto transport planes from Ramstein to Kuwait. I stared at it for a long minute. My entire life, the real version of it, lived inside that silence. I clicked the padlock open. Inside were the relics, old unit patches, commendations I couldn't hang on a wall, photos of friends who didn't make it home, and right at the bottom, the flat black document case. My pulse spiked. The seal was still intact, dark blue wax embossed with the Department of Defense insignia, stamped with a terrifyingly bright red warning, authorized by federal order only. My fingers hovered over the wax. The room felt like it was shrinking. I remembered the colonel's warning. Some documents protect information, Claire. Others protect people. This one does both. I grabbed the case. For the first time since this nightmare started, I realized my father had no idea whose cage he was actually rattling. The Fairfax County Courthouse smelled like wet wool and desperation. By the time Evelyn and I pulled up for the preliminary hearing, the vulture squad was already there. Reporters huddled under umbrellas as the gray clouds finally started dumping snow. Camera shutters sounded like cicadas the second I stepped out of the SUV. Major Bennett, is your record a total fabrication? Did your mother lie about your paternity to cover up an affair? Are you being investigated for federal fraud? Evelyn gripped my elbow, her voice a low growl. Eyes front, don't give him a syllable. Inside, the courthouse was buzzing. Small-town scandals are one thing, but a fake war hero story? That's premium gossip. I saw people whispering behind their hands as we walked toward the heavy oak doors. Then I saw him. Thomas Bennett was standing near the front row in a dark suit that suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his frame. He'd aged 10 years in the last few months. His shoulders were hunched, but his eyes still had that same monument coldness. Jake was standing right next to him, looking everywhere but at me. For a split second, a weak part of me wanted to walk over and beg. I wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him that this was insane and that we were family. I wanted him to look ashamed. But when he finally locked eyes with me, he didn't look like a father. He looked like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. You ready for this? Evelyn asked. No, I said honestly. Good. Honest people survive cross-examinations. Liars get cocky. We took our seats. The hearing started with the usual legal jargon, but the air in the room was toxic. The opposing counsel, a guy named Richard Vance who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of expensive soap, started painting a picture of me that I didn't recognize. He called me a manipulative opportunist, a daughter who abandoned her dying mother, and an officer with a suspiciously Swiss cheese service record. Vance held up a stack of my public files, smirking at the gallery. Your Honor, a significant portion of Major Bennett's so-called heroic accomplishments simply cannot be independently verified. We have gaps. We have administrative errors. Or, as we suspect, we have a defendant who's been inflating her resume for years to secure a slice of an estate she doesn't deserve. So-called, alleged. The words felt like physical slaps. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but Evelyn stayed as still as a statue. We are simply asking, Vance continued smoothly, if the defendant has falsified her entire identity for financial gain. The judge, Harold Whitmore, looked like he'd seen it all. He was 70-something, with a face that looked like it had been etched out of a granite cliff. His eyes were the only soft thing about him, and even they looked tired of the drama. When the court recessed for lunch, I bolted for the hallway, needing air that wasn't poisoned by Vance's lies. I was standing by the vending machines when I heard that familiar, heavy tread. "You should settle, Claire," my father said. I turned around slowly. He was standing there, leaning against the wall as if we were just chatting about the weather. "You heard the man. You're a fraud. Give Jake the house. Walk away while you still have a career left to pretend you're proud of." "You're doing all this for a house," I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. "You trashed Mom's reputation. You called her a cheater. You're destroying her memory for a pile of bricks." His jaw tightened, a vein throbbing in his temple. "That woman spent 20 years poisoning you against me. She made sure you looked down on me." The way he said, "that woman," instead of your mother, made something inside me finally snap. "She loved you, Dad. She spent her whole life trying to make me see the good man that wasn't actually there." "No," he spat, leaning into my space. "She pitied me, and you're just like her." He lowered his voice to a hiss. "You think those medals make you important? You think that uniform makes you more than a girl who ran away from home? You're nothing, Claire. And by the time I'm done, the whole world is gonna know it." I looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from old age, but from a desperate, wrought-to-the-core need to win. I realized then that this wasn't about the money. This was a public execution. He needed to destroy me because my success was a mirror that showed him exactly how much he'd failed. Back inside, the mood shifted. Evelyn started methodically dismantling their case. She produced banking records showing Jake's massive debts. She showed mortgage documents proving my mom had used her own inheritance to pay for the house. She even brought up the attempted digital hack on the county birth records. The judge's expression went from tired to dark. Then, Vance made the mistake of a lifetime. "Your Honor," Vance said, "the defense is stalling. We intend to call witnesses who will testify that the defendant frequently bragged about black ops missions and accolades that literally do not exist in the public record." Evelyn was on her feet before he could finish. "Impossible for whom, Mr. Vance?" She walked slowly toward the evidence table, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Your Honor, opposing counsel keeps implying that a lack of public records equals a lack of service." "Because there are no other records," Vance barked. "No," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave. "Because some records are protected by people far more powerful than anyone in this room." Vance let out a smug little chuckle. "Protected from a probate court, please." Evelyn didn't look at him. She looked at me. It was the signal. My heart was thumping so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out that flat black case. The moment it hit the mahogany table, the room went silent. Even the air seemed to thin out. Vance's smirk faltered. "What is that?" Evelyn ignored him entirely. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to submit sealed federal documentation regarding Major Claire Bennett's protected service record. This is a Tier 1 verification packet." My father let out a quiet, mocking snort. "Oh, this should be good. What'd she do? Get a certificate for best office worker in D.C. The judge beckoned Evelyn forward. When Judge Whitmore saw the Pentagon wax seal, his entire posture changed. He sat up straight, his eyes widening. He inspected the red authorization stamp for what felt like an eternity before breaking the seal. The sound of the paper crackling was the only noise in the room. You could have heard a pin drop on a carpet. The judge read the first page, then the second. His face went through a visible transformation, from skepticism to recognition, and finally to something resembling pure shock. He took his glasses off and reread a specific paragraph. My father shifted in his seat, looking annoyed. "Your Honor, can we get on with this?" The judge didn't even look at him. He just kept reading. Vance cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if there's an issue with the admissibility of these documents." "Sit, DOWN. The judge's voice was like a thunderclap. Even Evelyn blinked. I'd never heard a judge speak to a lawyer like that. Whitmore looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of my own rank being acknowledged by someone who understood it. "What the hell is in those papers, Judge?" my father demanded, his voice cracking. Judge Whitmore folded the papers with agonizing care. He placed both hands flat on his bench and leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you will not speak again unless I specifically tell you to. Am I clear?" The room froze. My father actually laughed once, a nervous, jagged sound. "I'm sorry, what?" The judge turned to the bailiff. Then, in a voice that shook the very walls of that courtroom, he said, "Everyone in this courtroom will stand up immediately." Chairs scraped against the tile. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. My father's face was suddenly the color of a bedsheet. Across the aisle, Jake looked like he was about to vomit. "Bailiff," the judge said, "lock the courtroom doors. No one enters and no one leaves." The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a metallic clack. My father looked around, his bravado finally crumbling. "What is this? What's going on?" Judge Whitmore ignored him. He looked directly at me. "Major Claire Bennett," he said, using my rank with a level of respect that made my throat tighten. "Please remain standing." "The federal documentation submitted to this court," Whitmore announced to the room, "confirms that Major Bennett's service record is protected under national security classification, authorized by the Department of Defense. These are not allegations. They are verified facts." The gallery exploded. People were gasping, leaning over the benches. "Classified? What did she do?" The judge slammed his gavel once. "Silence! These records establish that Major Bennett participated in multiple authorized operations involving diplomatic recovery and high-stakes defense coordination. She has been awarded commendations that this court, and certainly the plaintiff, does not have the clearance to even review in their entirety." Vance stood up, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I object to." "You object," Whitmore cut him off, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You brought a decorated officer into my court and tried to brand her a fraud because you couldn't find her file on Google. You weaponized her silence against her." My father looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Decorated? She worked in an office. She told me she was in logistics." Judge Whitmore looked at my father with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Mr. Bennett, your daughter is a hero of a grade you clearly can't comprehend. And the fact that you tried to use her dedication to this country to rob her of her mother's legacy. It's the most shameful thing I've seen in 30 years on this bench. Diplomatic extraction support, personnel recovery coordination, direct operational distinction, federal commendation under sealed authorization." Every single phrase the judge read out landed in that courtroom like a sledgehammer. I looked over at my brother, Jake. He looked physically ill, like he was about to lose his lunch right there on the polished hardwood. Me, I sat perfectly still. Years of military conditioning had literally wired my brain to lock down my emotions in public. But inside, my head was a war zone. Memories I'd spent a decade burying were screaming to the surface. I could taste the grit of a Kuwaiti sandstorm swallowing the road. I could smell the metallic, copper scent of blood inside a cramped transport bird. I felt the grip of a terrified embassy staffer on my arm while gunfire echoed just 3 blocks away. These were the ghosts I carried every day, while my father told the entire town I wasn't strong enough to hack it. Judge Whitmore finally lowered the papers, his eyes hard as flint. "This court acknowledges Major Bennett's service as legitimate, verified, and federally protected. The records are absolute." The words hit me harder than a physical blow. It wasn't just that a room full of strangers finally believed me, it was that my father was being forced to hear it. For the first time in my life, a man with more authority than him was dragging him face first into reality, and he absolutely hated the taste of it. "This is a joke," my father barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I don't care what shiny medals she bought herself. She's still a liar and she's still not my daughter." Evelyn stood up so fast her chair screeched. Actually, Your Honor, we're prepared to take out that trash next. She marched toward the bench with a second folder. This one looked older, the edges yellowed. This documentation was recovered via a deep-dive subpoena of the county archives, she explained. It's a legal filing made by Mr. Thomas Bennett himself, 22 years ago. I saw my father's entire body go rigid. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Evelyn opened the folder with surgical precision. In 2004, Mr. Bennett privately filed these documents in an attempt to surrender partial parental financial responsibility during a period of massive personal gambling debt. He was trying to dodge child support and school fees. The gallery erupted into whispers. Jake hissed, "Dad, shut up, just sit down." But my father just stood there, vibrating with rage. Judge Whitmore scanned the papers. His expression went from dark to downright murderous. "These records," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble, "explicitly identify Claire Bennett as your biological child. You signed these under oath to avoid a bill 20 years ago." My father's mouth hung open. No sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. "The plaintiff," Evelyn continued, her voice cold and steady, "knowingly submitted a fraudulent claim of disputed paternity solely to facilitate an illegal estate seizure. He didn't just lie to this court. He tried to weaponize the legal system to rob a soldier." "Mr. Bennett," the judge whispered, and the room went deathly quiet. "Did you knowingly provide fraudulent testimony to this court today?" My father's confidence didn't just crack, it shattered. "You don't get it," he stammered, his eyes darting around. "Her mother, she—" "No," the judge cut him off like a guillotine. "You don't understand the sheer weight of what you've done." Right then, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. Two men in sharp, dark suits walked in. No badges, no flashy gear, just that DC suit look that every person in the military recognizes instantly. Government, federal. One of them handed a packet of papers to the bailiff. The other scanned the room with a 1,000-yard stare until his eyes landed on me. He gave me a tiny, professional nod. My father looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Who are these people? What is this?" Judge Whitmore reviewed the new papers. "Due to the classified nature of the evidence improperly challenged during these proceedings," he announced, "a federal review has been triggered. We are looking at potential violations regarding falsified filings and unauthorized attempts to hack protected Department of Defense records." My father spun toward his lawyer, Vance, his eyes wide with panic. "You said this was just a probate case. You said it was a cakewalk." Vance looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and die. This wasn't about a house anymore. This was a federal felony charge knocking on the door. Jake stood up halfway, his voice cracking. "Dad, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything," my father screamed, but his voice sounded thin, frightened, old. I watched him unravel in real time, and the weirdest thing happened. I didn't feel like I'd won. I just felt exhausted. 28 years of trying to squeeze love out of a stone had finally tapped me out. Judge Whitmore turned to me. His voice was much softer now. "Major Bennett, this court owes you an apology." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You don't owe me anything, Your Honor." "Yes," he replied firmly. "I believe we do." It's a strange thing. Sometimes respect from a stranger in a black robe feels more healing than a lifetime of almost love from your own blood. My father pointed a shaking finger at me one last time. "She turned everyone against me," he wailed. "Eleanor always chose her. She ruined this family." I stood up slowly before Evelyn could grab my arm. The room went silent. I'd spent years imagining this moment, screaming at him, listing every bruise he'd left on my soul. But when it finally happened, I felt incredibly calm. "You know what the saddest part is, Dad," I said quietly. He stared at me, his lip trembling. "You still think this is about winning. You spent your whole life trying to make me feel small just so you could feel like a big man. And even now, with the feds in the room, you can't just tell the truth." I took a breath. "You didn't lose your daughter today, Claire. You lost her a long, long time ago." The words landed like lead. For the first time in my life, Thomas Bennett had absolutely nothing to say. Court was dismissed at 4:00 p.m. By then, the circus outside had doubled in size. News vans were lined up in the freezing rain. Someone had already leaked the classified hero angle, and the headlines were already hitting the internet. Decorated officer cleared in shocking courtroom twist. Evelyn and I took a private exit. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a headache. "You did good, kid," she said as we reached the elevator. I gave a jagged, tired laugh. "I feel like I'm about to pass out." "That's just the feeling of being human again," she smiled. "My husband was in Nam, spent 40 years pretending the memories didn't bite. I know honorable people when I see them." The doors closed and I was alone. Outside, the cold air stung my lungs, but it felt amazing. One of the federal agents, a tall guy with graying hair, paused as I got to my car. "You handled that like a pro, Major," he said. "For what it's worth, we know what you did over there, even if the rest of the world can't know the details." I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the rain blur the courthouse lights into gold streaks. All those years of secrets, of missing birthdays, of watching friends come home under flags, and the thing that almost broke me wasn't the war. It was my own father. 3 weeks later, the judge formally tossed every single claim my father made. The ruling was a bloodbath. It used words like fraudulent, malicious, and intentional deception. Jake vanished 2 days later, reportedly fleeing to Florida to dodge the debt collectors who were now circling since the inheritance evaporated. My father stayed in Cedar Hollow, but he was a pariah. In a small town, you can be a jerk, but you can't be a man who tries to frame his own daughter for fraud. His monument, status, didn't just crumble, it turned to dust. I went back to my mom's house in the spring. When I unlocked that front door, the smell hit me instantly: lavender, old paper, and home. I walked from room to room, seeing her reading glasses by the lamp, her favorite blanket on the couch. The grief was there, but it was different now. It was a quiet missing, not a loud drowning. While cleaning out the attic, I found a small cedar chest. Inside were letters from my mom. "Claire," one read, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and knowing your father, things are probably hard. He wasn't always cruel, but bitterness is a hungry thing. It eats everyone nearby. But never think his inability to love you is proof that you aren't lovable. He feared your strength because he was always doubting his own. I never did." I pressed that letter to my chest and cried harder than I had in the courtroom. I didn't sell the house. I renovated it. I kept her blue kitchen tiles and the creaky floorboards, but I painted the walls white and let the sunlight in. I used part of the estate to start a scholarship for daughters of military families, girls who want to serve but don't have anyone in their corner. One evening in October, I saw a shadow on the porch. It was him. He looked tiny. The monument was gone, replaced by a lonely old man in a coat that was too big. I opened the door but didn't let him in. "Claire," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "I heard about the scholarship. Your mother, she would have liked it." It was the first sincere thing he'd said in over 30 years. No bark, no bite, just a quiet admission of a ghost he'd spent a lifetime trying to outrun. But the thing about sincerity is that it doesn't have a reset button. It's a medicine that only works if it's administered before the heart stops beating. And standing there on my porch, I realized he was trying to treat a wound that had already scarred over decades ago. Sincerity, when it arrives this late, doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like a burden he was trying to hand off to me so he could sleep better at night. "I made mistakes, Claire." "Big ones," he whispered, his eyes searching mine, looking for a crack in the door, a way back into a life he had spent years trying to dismantle. He looked so small in the porch light, just an old man shivering in the Virginia wind, stripped of the uniform and the ego that used to make him look 10 feet tall. "My mother gave me this home, Dad," I said, my voice barely above the rustle of the fallen leaves. "She gave me a place where I could finally breathe. But you gave me something else. You gave me every reason to run, every reason to fight, and every reason to survive the impossible. And I did. I survived you." I saw his jaw tremble. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback or a lecture. He just stood there, finally realizing that there was no "I'm sorry" in the English language big enough to bridge the canyon he'd dug between us. There was no apology that could undo the courtroom lies, the insults to my mother's memory, or the years of cold silence. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement of a man who finally accepted that some things stay broken forever. Then he turned around and walked back into the dark, his footsteps heavy on the gravel driveway. I watched the taillights of his car fade into the distance, and I knew, with a strange sense of finality, that I would never see him again. People ask me all the time if winning the case felt like the ultimate satisfaction. They want to hear that I felt a rush of joy when the judge hammered that gavel. But the truth is more complicated. Justice is great for the public record. It gave me my name back and protected my mother's legacy. But justice isn't the same thing as peace. Real peace didn't come from a legal victory or a federal document. It came the moment I watched him walk away and realized I didn't feel a single spark of need for his approval anymore. I didn't need him to tell me I was strong. I already knew. Walking away from the man who tried to delete me and doing it with a quiet heart. That's what actually saved my life. If you've ever had to choose between protecting your peace and protecting your family's image, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you're down for more stories of survival and absolute revenge, hit that subscribe button. You're watching Real Reddit Revenge, and I'll see you in the next one.